Good day. Over the last couple of hours, there have been fewer reports from the Ukrainian battlefronts, other than the fact that the Russians have been carrying out very dense and heavy missile, artillery, and airstrikes all across the line of contact. But there's been little information about actual movements, actual advances on the fighting lines themselves. I say that, though just a very short time ago, the following report appeared on Redovka. Redovka, as I've said many times, is a Russian newspaper published in Smolensk. It has very strong pro-war positions. It nonetheless has a large number of reporters on the ground, and it is, in fact, in my opinion, an important site in order to try to get an overall view of what's going on in the fighting. Anyway, this report from Redovka, which is a few hours old, claims that Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut has now collapsed and that the Ukrainians are trying to withdraw from Bakhmut and that, in effect, the town is about to pass fully under Russian control. I'll just read it briefly. Armed forces of Ukraine are trying to break through to the defense line near Chasov Yar. Bakhmut has passed under the full control of the fighters of the Wagner organization. A source from Redovka reports that the armed forces of Ukraine are destroying abandoned equipment. Part of the personnel retreats to the Chasov Yar defense line, but is suffering heavy losses. Artillery is active at the moment. The head of the Wagner organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has not yet confirmed the information about the complete control over the city. Some Ukrainian fighters still remain within the settlement and are trying to get to Western positions. Now, that's from Redovka. It's an isolated report at the moment, but it is consistent with the trend of the fighting over the last couple of days and indeed the last couple of hours. Yesterday, I said that the British Defense Ministry has now admitted a crisis for the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, and we have had further reports since then over the last few hours of Russian forces, the Wagner organization forces, continuing to make progress in western Bakhmut. Prigozhin did release a report saying that fighting was still going on there, that Ukrainian troops were still resisting. But since that comment of Prigozhin's, we've had this further report from Redovka, which suggests an attempt by Ukraine to pull its troops out of Bakhmut, retreat to Chasov Yar, but that this is in some ways a disorganized retreat, and as I've discussed many times, it's coming very much, it's having to take place very much under the fire of the Russian guns. There were also reports earlier, by the way, which claimed that the Russians have actually cut the road from Ivanivska to Bakhmut itself, and if that is indeed the case, and I want to stress these are all unconfirmed reports at the moment, then it does look as if we're now in the final hours of this battle. Having said this, I want to stress again, these are unconfirmed reports at the moment. Quite likely, by the time you see these, watch this program, we'll have a clearer idea of what the situation in Bakhmut actually is, and then, of course, you get a further update tomorrow from me, and we'll look at the situation with more clarity then. In the meantime, everybody continues to talk about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, I want to just say that I've now had an opportunity to review some of these documents, this document dump, which has suddenly appeared, and I've come to the conclusion that these are indeed real documents and that they do originate with information provided by Ukraine itself, coordinated with NATO as well. Now, some sources have commented about these documents and suggested that they're fakes. They've suggested that the losses suffered by the Russians attributed to these documents are far too high, and that they correlate exactly with those of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. And they've also pointed out that these documents abruptly and without explanation increased the totality of Ukrainian losses killed in action from 16,000 to 65 to 70,000, and that these reports also provide information about Russian positions, Russian formations, deployments in Ukraine, which can be easily accessed from open sources. I don't think any of these arguments are compelling. Firstly, if the information does originate from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, then one would expect claims of Russian losses to correspond with those previously made by the Russian Ministry of Defense. That seems to me to be obvious. The fact that there's been a sudden multiplication of Ukrainian losses from 16,000 to 65,000 to 70,000, for the record, I don't take seriously either of these figures. Again, I suspect is a response to some queries from the Western side about whether Ukrainian losses were indeed as low as the 16,000 that Ukraine was claiming. And again, I suspect that it's, again, the Ukrainians themselves who provided updated information about their losses, which I suspect is still too low. And the fact that the information about Russian troop deployments can be obtained from open sources doesn't mean that these aren't actual Ukrainian documents. It just further confirms that despite all the various claims about massive minute observation of the Russians by satellites, all kinds of other things, that the Russian military has been actually quite successful in keeping its secrets. So I just wanted to say that I think these are genuine documents, and what they do show, to my mind, to my way of thinking, is that certainly as of the 1st of March, Ukraine was still far from ready, getting its forces ready to launch this offensive. There was still a lot of deploying and troop build-ups to do. There's certain aspects of these Ukrainian formations that have invited some puzzlement. It's caused some uncertainty, for example, why Ukraine would concentrate all its infantry fighting vehicles, its Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, in a formation that lacks tanks and things of that kind. I'm not going to get into the details of that. I just think that overall this does give a fairly good sense of Ukrainian preparations for the counteroffensive as of the 1st of March. It does seem as if Ukraine has prepared somewhere in the region of 9 brigades for this offensive. Now, on the face of it, that looks like a powerful force, but it's been suggested that we're talking about something like 45,000 men, which may not be anywhere near enough for an advance on multiple directions if these reports are indeed accurate, as they say they are. Incidentally, the Institute for the Study of War, this Washington-based think tank, very closely connected to the US military-industrial complex, and as far as I can see, published or produced by members of the Kagan-Nuland family, to a great extent at least, has said that this is going to be the biggest mobilization and build-up since the Second World War. On the strength of these documents, I would have said that that was probably not the case. It doesn't seem to me as if Ukrainian forces are anything like as strong as the Institute for the Study of War is saying. And I do wonder whether the Institute for the Study of War might have rushed out publication of that claim. It's obviously based on longer term analysis and study, but whether they might have rushed out this claim to try to offset to some degree the effect of the publication of these documents. This is just a guess, by the way. Anyway, it's absolutely clear to me also where the pressure for this offensive, the spring offensive by Ukraine, is coming from. We've had further comments from Secretary of State Blinken. He's again saying that a ceasefire would be an extremely bad idea. He clearly will not give up on his offensive. He wants this offensive to happen. He's pushing Ukraine into launching this offensive. I have to say, and I think people perhaps ought to take this fact into account, these statements by US officials, by Austin, and especially by Blinken, saying that there's going to be an offensive, saying that Ukraine has all the prospects of succeeding in this offensive, that the Russian forces are depleted and unable to carry on the fight and all that kind of thing. To me, these look like public pressure upon Ukraine to launch this offensive. In fact, I would go further. I would say that they're almost instructions to Ukraine to launch this offensive. How are the Ukrainians? Let's assume that they do an assessment of the situation on the battlefields, which for all I know they have done, an objective assessment, and would decide that this offensive was a bad idea. How could they come round and say now that this offensive will not be launched after their key paymaster and arms supplier, the US administration, has come out with the kind of statements that Blinken is making? So I think people need to understand that, and there's been a lot of discussion about US involvement in Ukrainian military planning. Well, we don't have to speculate about that. We don't have to look and sift through the information to establish that this is the case, because these public statements by Blinken and others, Austin especially, make the fact obvious. Now, there have been a series of comments by all kinds of Russian officials commenting both about the document leak and about the prospects of the Ukrainian offensive. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has come out and said that the document leak will certainly be taken into account by the Russian General Staff as they prepare as they can carry out their own planning. And of that, of course, I have no doubt. That is, of course, always assuming that it wasn't Russian intelligence which got hold of these documents, perhaps through a hack, perhaps through agents in Kiev, maybe, or Brussels, who knows? If it wasn't Russian intelligence that is responsible for this leak in the first place, I can't imagine anything more demoralizing to Ukrainian commanders than knowledge of the fact that the Russians not only know that there's going to be an offensive, but have details of their logistic arrangements and of their plans. That's the first thing. That was the first comment. That was from Peskov. Yan Gagin, Pushilin's advisor, has come out and said that if the Ukrainians do launch an offensive, they will suffer colossal losses, especially in the first days, and irrecoverable losses, especially in the first days. Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, whose the Chechen forces in the Russian military that are participating in this operation are said to number around 9,000, and that's a steady number since the start of the conflict. Kadyrov has said that he's looking forward to this offensive, that it will enable the Russians not only to break the Ukrainian military, but also to capture large numbers of prisoners and also large numbers of trophy weapons. And I read another report somewhere that the Russians expect that something like 70% of the equipment that Ukraine will use in this offensive is likely to be destroyed. Well, whether or not all that's true, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's what the Russians are saying. For the record, the most interesting, for me, explanation or view of this offensive comes from Vladimir Rogov, who is the head of the, one of the people involved in the Zaporozhye, the Russian-backed Zaporozhye government. And he's made a number of really interesting comments on Russian television on Solovyov Live. He says, "We have prepared several deeply layered defense lines, beginning with the banal dragon's teeth, as they're called by people, cone-shaped structures intended to halt the advance of tanks when these tanks are bombarded by our artillery, our air force, multiple rocket launch systems, and so on. The same refers to minefields. Our troops are ready. They know the front line, the Zaporozhye direction, and understand well what to do." And then he went on to say that all the talk about the Zaporozhye direction being a weak link in the Russian defense lines may stem from local terrain features. Plains and continuous steppe are nowhere to find a natural barrier. There would exist certain possibilities for the quick advance of armor or an armored force if the defense lines were not normal, were not organized properly. But that is not the case, and this will certainly not be an easy ride for the enemy. So Rogov appears to say that the Russians have their defenses organized in Zaporozhye. They've made up for the lack of obvious defensive barriers, natural defensive barriers, by constructing these enormous fortified lines, and they're ready. They're ready for whatever the Ukrainians throw at them, and they know what to do. I would add that way back at the time of the Kherson counteroffensive, it was actually suggested that the fact that we're talking about open steppe land would actually work in a case like this to the advantage of the defenders, because it would mean that the attacking force would not be able to conceal itself behind natural formations like hills and such things, and that it would make it easier for artillery and aircraft to pick out knockout tanks and armoured vehicles and that sort of thing. And my recollection of the fighting over the course of the Kherson counteroffensive strongly suggested that that was probably the truth. So I just want to say that it may be that the landscape is not quite as beneficial to the defence, especially a defence lacking artillery, as some people perhaps imagine. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about all of these preparations. Now, perhaps because the British Ministry of Defence has said that the has basically was talking yesterday about what looked like the imminent fall of Bakhmut. Today, they're talking about the failure of the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy system. Well, the Ukrainian energy system is in fact still up and running, and in fact Ukraine says that it's going to resume electricity exports. However, my sense is that it has been very, very badly knocked about, and one of the reasons why energy exports have resumed is because energy consumption in Ukraine has almost certainly sharply fallen because of the enormous damage that's been done to Ukrainian industry. My own personal view about the attacks on the energy system, and here I'm going to say, it's contrary to my own assessments at the time, my own view was that it was not intended to knock it out entirely. John Helmer made a suggestion at one point, which I still think might very well be a valid one, that the Russians were launching these missile strikes on the energy system, not so much to knock it out as to discover its weak points and to degrade it in order to make it a more vulnerable target when the big missile strikes eventually came in support of whatever big offensive the Russians were intending to launch. And I suspect that is still true. But it's now absolutely clear to me, and has been commented on by many people, that the immediate purpose of these attacks on the energy system was to deplete the Ukrainian air defense system. The Ukrainians had to expend a very large proportion of their arsenal of S-300 surface-to-air missiles in order to defend this energy system. And the result has been significant gaps now in their air defense network, which they're finding it extremely difficult to fill. And it's interesting that the US government, in its latest assessments, its latest statement of weapon systems that it is going to deliver to Ukraine, has emphasized the need to provide air defense systems, though it's also increasingly clear to me that the United States doesn't have the means to fill the gap. So, to fill in the gaps. So that's why we're seeing the Russian Air Force more active now. And as I said, it was more active over the last few days. There was a report early on during the Russian air offensive in the Financial Times, as I remember, which made exactly that point. And we see that this is exactly how things have turned out. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russians won't come after the energy system eventually. I suspect they will. But as I said, for the moment, I think they've probably degraded it to a certain level. They will presumably continue to hammer it from day to day and from time to time, just to keep it at its same degraded level. But they have significantly weakened Ukraine's air defense system, perhaps the most important asset that Ukraine, military asset that Ukraine had in advance of the war. And we're starting to see the consequences of all of that. Anyway, before I finally wrap up on military news, just one last detail, which is that the London Times that has now come up with a long discussion of the failed, in fact, in my opinion, crazy Ukrainian attempt back in October to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. And apparently around 600 people were involved, 30 boats were used. Anyway, the Times has given a detailed account of the operation, which, from what I can see, corresponds exactly with what the Russians were saying at the time. Now, here again, I have to admit an error. When I first heard reports about these attacks on the Zaporozhye power station coming from the Russians, I found them so outlandish, so bizarre, that I thought they couldn't possibly be true. And I said that it looked to me as if this was a case of the Russians engaging in a certain amount of propaganda by inventing Ukrainian attacks which hadn't happened. And my recollection is that at the time, pretty much all of Ukrainian channels were denying that these attacks were taking place, and of course the Western media were ignoring these attacks. Well, here we now have this report by the London Times. It seems the attacks did take place. They were completely unsuccessful, just as the Russians said. The pattern of the attacks was, as I said, identical to what the Russians were claiming. The denials were false, and my initial doubt, skepticism about these attacks, they turned out to be entirely wrong. I will say this for myself, I did eventually come round to accepting that the Russians were getting it right and that there were Ukrainian attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I found it bizarre then. I still find it bizarre today. And I wonder who it was who came up with this idea. And I wonder whether that person has suffered any consequences, any career consequences for sending brave men to their deaths on what was clearly a fool's errand. I doubt it, actually. Anyway, there we go. That's all I am going to say about the situation on the battlefronts today. I'm going to say a few things now about Macron's trip to Beijing, because I discussed it yesterday. I hadn't realized when I discussed the program yesterday the full extent of the debacle. It seems that over the course of Macron's visit with Xi Jinping, he was repeatedly bringing up the question of Ukraine, that Xi Jinping was showing increasing signs of frustration and impatience, that he was sighing at various points during the discussion, that Xi Jinping stuck to the well-known and well-established Chinese position about the conflict in Ukraine, but Macron insisted on ploughing on regardless. Now, I think the Chinese were definitely offended and annoyed by all of this, but more to the point, it's clear to me that Macron has massively lost face, and there are now articles starting to appear in the Western media which basically acknowledge the debacle. Now, some of them are appearing in the English language media, Politico, the Daily Telegraph. I think the ones that are going to do Macron the most harm are those which are starting to appear in the French media, Le Monde, Figaro, Les Echos, apparently other places, all discussing how Macron found Xi Jinping immovable, but refused to take no for an answer. And I have to say, yet again, this is very much in the character of Emmanuel Macron. As I said previously in my video yesterday, when in the run-up to the start of the fighting in February, he made those trips to Moscow, he actually lost a lot of goodwill with the Russians by talking for hours about ideas that they could never pin down and basically giving all the impression of pressuring them to try to call off the conflict, even though he was never making anything more than vague assurances which never translated into actual promises of proper discussions. Anyway, it looks as if Macron has done the same thing to himself with the Chinese. The Chinese are not in conflict with France. They're not in conflict with the European Union in the way that the Russians are. It's clear from reading the Chinese media that though the Chinese were frustrated by Macron's behavior, they're not going to themselves initiate any cutback of contacts with France or with Europe. Hardly in their interest to do so. But as I said, it's clear that in Xi Jinping's eyes, Macron has lost face. Now, for the record, let me repeat a point which I made in a recent video that has been published on the Duran, which was made by Alex Christoforou and myself, in which we touched on Macron's visit and the purposes of Macron's visit. Now, this visit has been a long time in preparation and discussion, and Macron visited Beijing in response to a long-term invitation from Xi Jinping. But it's clear to me that the timing of this visit was affected by Western alarm at what happened over the course of the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in Moscow 2 weeks ago. The clear signs that the Chinese and the Russians are continuing to work together, in fact, are drawing even closer to each other. That triggered a wave of alarm in Washington and in European capitals. And the United States, for its part, I think, is becoming increasingly frustrated by its inability to have direct contacts with the Chinese government. So Secretary Blinken was supposed to travel to China a few weeks ago, but then the incident over the balloon, the Chinese balloon that flew over the United States, caused a postponement of that visit. The US, ever since, has been trying to get that visit back on track. The Chinese, for the moment, are refusing to receive Secretary Blinken. And the United States has also been working hard to try to get a telephone discussion or even a virtual summit set up between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. Biden said that he wanted to speak to Xi Jinping to clear the air after the balloon incident. And again, the Chinese are refusing to speak with, they're refusing all requests to set up this telephone call. There have also been requests, pressure from the West for the Chinese to have a discussion with Zelensky in Ukraine. And there were some suggestions that Xi Jinping would speak to President Zelensky of Ukraine directly after his trip to Moscow. And that also hasn't happened. And it's not difficult to understand why the Chinese are refusing to entertain these calls. They're obviously furious with the US over the balloon incident, over Taiwan, but also they're not in the mood to receive any warnings, any threats from the United States over their proximity to Russia. So, unable to get their own people to Beijing or to establish direct contacts with Beijing, we see this troop of European dignitaries, Sanchez, Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, being sent to Beijing instead, carrying with them the same message that the United States, that the administration has been unable directly itself to give. And we see what happens. The Chinese have entertained all these visitors. They still retain some hopes that there might just possibly be flickers of strategic autonomy, as the Chinese like to say, by the Europeans from the United States. But they're disappointed. They have seen that the Europeans come along to China and they speak exactly the same tune. And we see how exasperated and frustrated the Chinese are becoming. Well, there we go. A debacle for Macron. As I said, he was, shall we say, the messenger of information that the Chinese didn't want to hear. It bewilders me, by the way, why he was happy, allowed himself to be used in that way. And I can't help but think that from a French point of view, Macron has once again let down France. As I said, in the old days, I can't imagine a Pompidou or even a Mitterrand, certainly not a Chirac, and of course inconceivable a de Gaulle, letting themselves be used in that kind of manner, or putting themselves in a position where they found themselves refusing to take no for an answer from the president of China, and thus damaging France's image in China and indeed the rest of the world. Well, China's not the only country on the receiving end of pressure at the moment. We've also heard that the United States has sent its CIA director, William Burns, who seems to act as a kind of unofficial emissary to Riyadh, where he's had meetings with Crown Prince, MBS and others, apparently, and where he's expressed US frustration that Saudi Arabia is working with Russia, cutting oil production, and has reopened political links to Iran. And again, I suspect that Burns, in fact, I'm sure that Burns will have been as coldly received in Riyadh as Macron was in France. Macron was in China. Well, there we are. In any negotiation, in any discussion, in diplomacy, a fundamental rule is that you take no for an answer. If the other side says no, you accept that and you move on. You should never get into a situation of trying to argue and reason, as Macron presumably imagines that he could do, the other side out of its well-established position. It doesn't work like that. The fact that the US and some of its European allies are engaging in this eccentric behavior, this deeply undiplomatic behavior, demonstrates once more that the United States and the Western powers have lost their gift for diplomacy. They no longer know what diplomacy is. A good visit by Macron to China would have steered clear of the whole topic of Ukraine entirely. Perhaps there might have been a few comments saying that there was a general agreement about the need to restore peace and to avoid use of nuclear weapons and that kind of thing, but it wouldn't have gone beyond that. It would instead have looked for points of agreement with China on other matters, of which there are many. Instead, as I said, the entire discussion seems to have been taken up by Ukraine and by Russia to the extreme exasperation of the Chinese. Now, I ought to say that alongside all of this, all of these diplomatic moves, alongside the preparations for the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, the British media in particular has been writing article after article, which has been getting ever more bizarre. There have been articles about how Vladimir Putin might face his Julius Caesar moment. In other words, somebody would rush off and kill him in the way that Julius Caesar was murdered in the Senate on the 15th of March, 44 BC. There have been suggestions that General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, might eventually, out of exasperation, launch a military coup against Putin. There have been reports about Putin's descent into paranoia, about how he only travels around Russia now in an armoured train. Lots of pieces like this. And there's also today an article in the Daily Telegraph about Saudi Arabia, how Saudi Arabia is at risk of being obliterated by China. Chinese production of electric vehicles is going to crush demand for Saudi Arabia's oil. So the inner message is Saudi Arabia shouldn't get close to China. There's also other articles about how Macron's failure in Beijing has supposedly enabled Xi Jinping to proceed with his master plan for world domination. I mean, I have you not, that's the actual title of this article does in fact refer to world domination. Now, I think I want to just explain briefly what the purpose of these articles is. They're not so much directed at the British public, though no doubt many people in Britain read them, they see the headlines, it helps them to form their view about the way in which the war is going, the diplomatic conflict is going. The major audience for these articles are the embassies of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all of those countries in London. They, of course, all check out and report to their capitals about any article that concerns their country. And, of course, they will be passing on to Moscow, Beijing and Riyadh summaries, at the very least summaries of these articles. They'll be passing them on to their foreign ministries, where they will be circulated amongst the, presumably to some extent at least, amongst the leaders of these countries. And of course the purpose of these articles is to sow doubt, to percolate within these countries, the leadership groups of these countries, a sense of worry and uncertainty. I don't think they have any such effect. I think by now, Saudis, the Russians, the Chinese have become used to this kind of thing. And of course, what it also does is that it simply confirms for all of these governments that the media, the once famously independent media of the West, of Britain in this case, has now simply become a sounding board and messaging platform for the British government. Anyway, that's me for the day. As I said, these are shorter videos because of the time constraints that I'm now working under. Just to remind you that you can find all our work on various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also, if you want to support our work, do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, see the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our rucksacks. We now are also doing rucksacks and bottles and all sorts of great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. Tomorrow, more news, possibly news about Bakhmut having fallen, or perhaps the fighting will still be going on. Anyway, that's me for the day, and have a very good day, and more from me soon.